track started with me seeing an edit from another DJ, showing his edit, and I knew I had to make an absolute banger edit. So the kick had to be a thumpy kick, and it had to be a short decay, so I reduced it as a one shot. Also bring up the frequency thump, which is around 100 hertz on most kicks. I also use this free saturation plugin, which is called Chow Tape Model, and I use it on the Fat 2 setting, which kind of just adds to the punch and helps it like punch through the mix with some added sub-harmonic frequencies, giving the kick more character as it reduces decay. So with the bass, so here's I have two basses. So the top bass is using Serum. And so with the first oscillator, we have a sawtooth, and then with the second oscillator, we have a square wave. And so that all feeds into a low pass envelope filter, which is this here. And with the effects, we just use some subtle distortion. So you can see here I've got an EQ8 with just a slight high pass filter with some saturation, as well as a little bit of sideshow. And so you can see I've also got some ozone imaging. This is probably my favorite plugin, to be honest. It just adds some really good widening stereo imaging to it. So the MIDI is quite simple. It just starts with a standard offbeat progression that pairs with this guitar sample with some added groove on every last beat of the bar. Sub bass. So this is where I only want the sub bass frequencies, as you can see. And so I've also added some room for the kick to breathe, and then I put that on a bass mono, a huge side chain. So all together with the kick and bass, it just sounds like. So I've also routed the kick group. And so with that, I just add some punch in parallel. I make sure to EQ off the sub 20 hertz frequency range, just because you're not gonna be able to hear that. And it's gonna money with the mix. And then drum bass, love adding drum bass. So here's how I make my signature drums. Usually a standard clap, but since it's an MJB, you know I'm gonna add that classic snare filling up the mid-range, but having slight highly saturation, as you can see. Then I add my signature sound on the third beat. So I sample both and then reverse that, adding just before each hit on the third hit. So you can hear this. And so then open hats, standard. Make sure to cut it all the way off so it's just really tight and snappy. And then every first hit of every 4 bars, I had a crash. You see that? And then some added percussion elements. So this is a classic MJB, a classic hi-hat in every 1/8 note. Then add a percussion loop that you can barely hear. And it's just to add a little bit more grit and texture. And probably the only time you can hear that is at the start of the actual. And so all together the drums sound like this. So all drums are sent to the drum group, which I have as a drum bus and then a high pass filter. Cut off any low frequencies, leaving the space for the bass and the mid-range to breathe. So the guitar sample. I knew this track needed that filthy guitar melody, so I had to align each note on the beat and the track itself, and then since it's played live, it doesn't actually align with the strict BPM, so then I had to consolidate them, and then afterwards, the stems were extremely wide, so I had to use a utility plugin to mono each one, and then resample it, then add ozone stereo imaging again to widen them, also using a fab filter. Clip any of the high frequencies. So another note was that the actual sample wasn't tuned. since it was played live, and back in those days I don't think they had any Justin Bieber auto tune, so this made my bass line sound really off. So tweaking the sense of each note with the help of the tuner, my eyes made it perfect. This took me a couple headaches and a couple days. That was more or less the normal guitar line, and then you play this with the bass and kick. Next up is synths, right? So I knew that had to be epic AF. So I matched the guitar melody and then I put it into a serum with a respace. So it sounds like this. Of course I put another trance gate on. So this is what it normally sounds like without a trance gate. And so this is my little serum patch that I got. Copy those oscillator settings if you want to see that. I'm not going to explain it all the way here because it's going to be too long. And on top of that, I had to add another layer to fill it out. And so this is the patch. And so really critical with that is that since it was a top layer, you only want to hear the upper frequencies. And also I arpeggiated it as well with some OTT just to bleed through the mix. Also other effects like auto pan. I used a wider plugin as well. I use this time to time as well as the ozone, but I find it's not as controllable, so I don't use it as much. So last synth was a bit of a call and response synth. I paired it really nicely with the Beat It vocals. So you can see this is this synth. So next up are the pads. So one I made using Serum. So this is the one I got frozen, so I can't show you, but very analog, very digital. Then I actually sampled the Rhodes from the song. And then on top of that, I used a very euphoric vocal from the song, which I reverbed and echoed to blend it with the rest of the elements, which fit really nicely with the break. So I'll show. And then all of them together. So lastly, I put the vocals, which is a fair bit going on, but mainly just compression, widening. Lastly, the effects. So the gong stem at the start of the track, which is sampled from the first hit with the echo and then reverb. Then I'll reverse it. This is my signature trick, especially when introducing new samples. So I'll show you. Heaps of white noise sweep ups. You can see these. So on this, it's a really good trick to do. What I do is I put the actual warp mode on beats, and then I do preserve. I go 1/8, and then I change this through mode to only one way, and then I put this down to around 30. And so it automatically just hit on the transients of every preserve mode that you set it to, so the 1/8, 1/16, 1/4. And so I actually lead it from a 1/4, so it goes to a 1/8, and it goes to 1/16, and we go. So guys, so. Also, I sampled the actual snare drop from the track just as a snare roll. You can use any type of snare roll, but this is really the anticipation from the build up to the drop together. So, and so also I used the kick pattern from the start, which transitions just to a normal like synthwave kick pattern that they've got. Lastly, on the master, I always do this on all my tracks. I always put mono when the drop isn't playing, and also a EQ, a high pass EQ filter. So I find the best way to separate the drops from the breaks and to make your tracks hit like a ton of bricks is to use mono and EQ. So when the mono's on, EQ's also on with a high pass filter. So that way, when they transition into the drops, it's all of a sudden, oh my God, it's also wide now. And then the EQ is suddenly off. You're like, oh, I need the bass as well now. And so I've also got some limiting, make sure that it's not peaking when I actually master it later. And then this span tool, which is really useful for mastering as well, I find.